Second digital contribution, because both Precious and also David Adjaye couldn't be here because of the COVID situation. They're going to join us another year here in Zurich. We're going to now see the film of David Adjaye. It will connect very directly to the panel from before, David Adjaye's reflection on the museum in the 21st century. David Adjaye started Adjaye Associates in 2000. The office is based today between Accra, London, and New York, and from the very beginning, he focused on an ethos for communities in the work. Of course, the most well-known project is the National Museum of African American History in Washington, D.C., and very often these projects have to do with community vibrancy, connecting very directly to memory and matter, to the élan vital also of Bergson. Now, it's interesting in David Adjaye's work that it started a lot with him actually moving during his childhood because his father was a diplomat, so he lived between Kampala, Nairobi, Cairo, Beirut, Accra, and Jeddah during his childhood. He got very inspired by Hassan Fatty, also by the Japanese architects Toyo Ito and Kenzo Tange, to become an architect, and research has often played a big role in the practice. For example, his seminal book, Adjaye Africa Architecture, a photographic survey of metropolitan architecture, where he made a portrait really of every capital in Africa. He often states that architecture is a social act, not only in terms of inclusive design, but also as a means of reflecting on the human legacies embedded in the built past. And that's, of course, also something you will see in the online contribution of Suleiman Bachadiagne, who talks about historicity, particularly in relation to African history, and connects actually Bergson in his book Postcolonial Bergson to many independence movements. Adjaye said in an interview, the way we write the history of our time in physical materials, matter, that we leave behind for others to learn from, to make better worlds for their generations and the generations to come. We make buildings to learn about ourselves as a society and to make things better. And that, of course, is also relevant in relation to his reflections on Felwine Sarr and Benedict Savoy's 2018 report of the restitution of African sculpture, something which is super relevant, I think, and I think we can't talk about the museum in the 21st century without entering into this restitution discussion, providing a framework actually to guide the emergence of new institutions, because David is actually the architect of the Edo Museum of West African Art in Benin City in Nigeria, and he sees this as one of, maybe the first of many, many institutions in Africa to come, which follow a different model to the Western institution. He sees it actually as an effort to decenter the power dynamic and the objectification created by the West. So here David Adjaye in his video interview. Thank you.
The theme of the art talks this year is matter and memory. La matière et la mémoire. It's a reference to the book of Bergson from 1896. And it's, of course, intended as a broader umbrella for a multitude of questions that can be interpreted in relation actually to Bergson's philosophy, from body-spirit relation to sustainability, to memory, which plays a big role in your work, and time. And I'm going to speak also to Suleiman Bachadiagne, the great philosopher from Senegal, who's New York-based, and who wrote this book about colonial Bergson. And we're going to discuss, of course, with Suleiman, conceptions of time and memory. And this follows last year's Engadin Art Talk, the project initiated by Christina Bechler, which we curated, Bice Korriger, Daniel Baumann, and Philippe Buschbung. And last year was about la longue durée, about the kind of idea also of liberating society from a short-termism, as Roman Kajanik says. And this year it's matter and memory. And I just want to begin rather broadly to ask you, what does the theme speak to you about?
Thank you, Hans. It's wonderful to be in conversation, our ninth conversation. I look forward to our 10th. Matter and memory. Matter and memory, it couldn't be more poignant, because I think really the sort of second decade into the 21st century, this has become the most profound discussion, I think, that this century is really going to negotiate. For me, in terms of museums and architecture, this idea of matter and memory become very, very important discussions to uncouple and to have more clarity, and to really get a sense of what I call the unfolding of the stories, to kind of in a way for me to release the objects back to their provenance, really. So really meaning by that really, I mean, I think that the 17th, 18th, and 19th century construction of the museum, as understood in the Western canon, has unraveled. And it's unraveled around the idea of the, you know, as we engage more and more and understand the kind of full impact of colonialism, the actual residue, the evidence base, which has now, ironically, you know, the museums were the places where the colonial masters, you know, created the safe houses for the raids that were made, and now those very safe houses have become actually the evidence base that is transmitted into the 21st century, and has allowed the colonies to, those that were colonized but still may have countries, to suddenly start to really question exactly what the hell has happened for the past 300-400 years. And what is this idea of knowledge and universal knowledge? What is this idea of, you know, enlightenment, and whose enlightenment, and which privilege of gaze is important? All these things I think have come absolutely head and center to the construction of the museum as a kind of model of civilization, only for it to, I think, crash, and to really have to question itself and its own sort of, you know, part in this idea of the colonial project, which sort of literally touched every part of society and life. So, you know, and central to that colonial project is the idea of matter, you know, the extraction of matter literally for the creation of wealth, but the extraction of cultural and spiritual matter for the kind of, you know, the consumption of those who it was not meant for, and the loss of memory from those from which it was taken, and the sort of the new constructions of memories and myths by those who have enjoyed the provenance of objects that were not theirs. So it's really a very extraordinary subject, and one that I'm sure we're not going to in any way solve, but one that hits to the heart of critical issues that need to be dealt with, at least be discussed, and paths found to create a kind of much more resolved position from which we can all grow from.
Thank you very much. That's a great answer. And of course, you address these questions in your work in many different ways. One important dimension in your practice, I mean, actually more interestingly enough, I saw that kind of ever since we know each other, almost like every year, the museum plays a bigger role in your practice. There is more and more museum projects you're building, and maybe it's nice that we can talk a little bit about some of the different museum projects which all address the topics you've just outlined in different ways. And I wanted to begin with the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, because as you once told me, that is a most important example really of how museums can offer a very specific narrative alongside a universal message. It's also important in relation to memory. I mean, as Eric Hobsbawm says, amnesia is very present also in this digital age. It's not because we have more information that there is less amnesia. So he was asking for a protest against forgetting, and I suppose that's another dimension of this of your museum. And then you also said that there is the hope that the museum will offer an open exploration of history and culture and society, and address profound aspects of the human condition actually in relation to matter and memory. Can you tell us a little bit about the genesis of the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, and how you see it now, a couple of years after its opening?
So really, it came at a moment at the beginning of the 21st century when this critical question of who speaks the story, who has the right to tell the story, and how the story is being played out in its public life, really hit a zenith, really, after, and the conversations that it was 200 years, but the last 20 years really were the critical moment where, a sort of divided house, really, the Democrats and the Republicans, finally threw a president, Bush, President Bush, the son, and allowed a site literally in front of the White House to be the site for this, one of these, the last Smithsonians to be built on the Mall. I mean, there may be another one, but one of the last, can I say. And the conversation was about, really uncoupling this dilemma and this dialectic about African Americans within the narrative of American history. The dialectic speaks also to the Indian, sort of the native Indian history, but in a way that had been built. But that was a kind of a more, almost like an erasure. So that was a kind of colonial erasure. And this is a colonial enslavement and a kind of commodification of a people, but then who are allowed to become part of the sort of story, but not really. So evidence has been building up not in academic circles, but really within the body of the population, the popular body of the African-American community. They have literally stored and refused the erasure of their story by keeping their stories amongst themselves. And this museum, which really, when it was opening, had nothing. There were no objects. It was the first kind of museum where it wasn't from a kind of great donation or an amazing collection. It was, we're going to start this project and we're going to collect from the people, sensing that the people had this information and that there were some pieces, in the sort of main Smithsonian collection of American history. There were like 3,000 or 4,000 pieces. But in the end, 40,000 objects have been taken from the community, and it's growing. This was 3 years ago, that number was 40,000. I'm sure it's much more now. I haven't sort of checked. So the body of a museum made through the kind of memory embedded in a community that was traumatized, but felt that they would have their righteous day one moment, is really the whole kind of, discussion of why the Smithsonian is so profoundly important. And part of, for me, the beginning of the unraveling of the sort of mythology of the story and the decoupling of the idea of who speaks history. So when that competition was announced, it was profoundly important to me because it signified a kind of moment. And it was at a really important moment of a transition between a sort of Republican president and a Democratic sort of president who was, looked like it was about an agenda of transformation and change profoundly in America. Unfortunately, we're swinging back and forth as we now see in history. But we had 2 terms, sort of 8 years. And those 8 years allowed the passage of this museum to be created on this, the empire of the world, the first empire of the world's kind of front lawn, which really actually questioned the very narratives which had been spun for hundreds of years before it. And I think that with that, a kind of uncoupling has happened around the world of the ability to hold the myth of the curtain up. So the Smithsonian really is about, this project that really reestablishes, not really by the profoundness of its artifacts, they're incredible artifacts and they're moving artifacts, but in a way, a new space where it's not really the kind of preciousness or the exoticness of the objects that are profound, but their relationship to history and their ability to use their matter to use the theme that we're discussing, to help chart the course into history, to then to be able to chart the course forward. And that, really, I think that museum project profoundly shaped my thinking about the questioning of museums globally. Really, what is a museum now? what does the museum do? Who's it talking to? Who's it talk from? And what is the message that we're sending to generations? So in a way, it really is this extraordinary moment that happened in history that allowed this building to be built. So it is a kind of exemplar. And, you know, for me, the building had to be everything that was not on the mall. It had to be everything that was not on the mall. And to show that there was a kind of a new idea that needed to be established about a new dialogue. And ironically, it has now become the most popular, you know, museum on the mall amongst both Black and white communities, and all professing to just have not understood or known the profound nature of the injustice of the story, which has really been incredible to see on both sides, you know. So for me, you know, that sort of data and that sort of information has galvanized me to really very much really question and work with. You know, for me, I'm not really interested in this idea of a kind of, oh, well, let's just destroy everything in the West and let's, you know, take everything back. It's not really about that, because, you know, there is a collective idea that I specifically completely believe in. But I believe that it is our job in every generation to correct and shift the injustices and the inaccuracies if they are brought to light. And if history brings them to light and conditions bring them to light, it is upon us, it is incumbent upon us to shift. It's really a kind of a rallying cry for us to shift and move. And I think that responding to that actually creates a new momentum and a new agency, which I think helps our collective intelligence and our collective knowledge. So, you know, so we've had 400 years of uncoupling. Maybe we've got another couple of 100 years of of coupling, and now we've got to decouple and reconstruct a world that can actually make sense, as we are now realizing that we are, you know, for the first time because of technology, not just nations, but we are now a planet. I think that the 21st century is also the beginning, not just of scientists, but of people realizing we live on a ball floating in a cosmos in a real sense, tangible sense, because of our visibility to it. So we move from nations which are bound and somehow fiction driven to a planet. And I think that we then realize that the way in which we find knowledge and use knowledge and what knowledge tells us also has to shift, because ultimately the knowledge that has been built through the colonial project is inadequate for the world that has now emerged and full of holes. And for any rational thinking person, completely not able to hold water. So instantly for me, the construction of that colonial model of museum, as romantic and as beautiful as it is, and they're the most, you know, how can it not be? It holds some of the treasures of the world, is completely irrelevant.
And that brings us to the museums you're building now for the 21st century. And I wanted to begin that chapter actually with asking you about the Studio Museum. You're designing the new building for Therma Studio Museum, actually 125th Street in New York City. It's a lab. It's less about the collection. It's a lab. It's an education space. It's also about process, because artist studios are presented there. So it's almost like, as you once told me in a previous conversation, a triptych. You know, there is basically a triptych of these three things. It's also a collage of stacked volumes, and it's interesting because I just basically did this little book of all my conversations with Edouard Glissant, where we talk a lot about the kind of Glissantian idea of the museum, and he obviously, coming from Martinique, you know, then teaching in New York and in Paris, he always wanted to basically do a museum for Martinique about the multiplicity of both American continents, which he wanted to actually be sort of trans-historical. He imagined that museum to be an archipelago. He said we should avoid museums to be continents, because continents are organizing, continents are oppressive. So it needs to be more generous, like an archipelago. And when I asked him what he meant with that, he told me that he thinks that a museum should house a network of interrelationship and should really create this possibility also to be open for the future, to kind of not only point to urgent issues, but actually to respond to them. He imagined the that institution to be quivering, no, and also to be a place that transcends established systems of thought. And in a way, when I asked him to kind of nail it, to define what that utopia should be, he said it's not so much about utopia as something static. So he's very much against this idea of Moore's utopia as being too static. But he talked about the dynamic idea, and sort of that institution should maybe look for the utopian point where all the world's cultures could meet. Anyway, these things came to my mind when I was thinking about the 21st century, and I wanted to ask you to tell us more about your amazing plans with Therma for the Studio Museum.
No, I mean, Clisson is really was ahead of this and saw it coming, and really left us really blueprints for how to navigate this. And the idea of the archipelago, what is the archipelago? A network of interconnected land bodies that creates an ecology that is very fruitful and fertile and creates coral bases and all these incredible things. And what is that? That's a great metaphor for knowledge, right? It's a great sort of knowledge vehicle and a producer of knowledge. What is happening in America is really a kind of, I think, just profound about what is happening in the world and is starting to happen in the world, and it will go around the world, not just within the African American community and the African community, but with all other kind of displaced communities. And you can see it happening in questions and dialogue everywhere. The Studio Museum is really about in the absence. So first, there's the erasure of the kind of memory of the people who had provenance of these objects that were then taken from them. So that erasure happened by, putting them apparently in museums that everybody could go to, but actually the people who it was taken for are the people that are least likely or least able to see those artifacts. I mean, how ironically shameful is that? That an African is the person that is least likely to be is most likely to be denied a visa to go to Europe to see a cultural object that comes from him. It's like a joke almost when you finally sort of break it down.